Hi, welcome back. I'm here today with Rob Scott. And Rob, you're joining us from Sydney, Australia, is that right?
Yes, El, welcome. And it's a pretty wet Sydney at the moment, but it's good to be with you.
Yeah, absolutely good. I mean, I saw you a few months ago. The world was very different there in Sydney in March. And, here we are. And you're there with Deloitte, and you've been working with many firms on how to deal with not only this crisis, but how to deal with data in analyzing what is happening with workers and what's the best going forward strategy with regards to return to workplace and safety and so forth. So if you would, you mind introducing yourself and share a little bit about what you do there at Deloitte?
Yeah, thanks, El. And I predominantly focus in the human capital space, particularly around understanding the future of work and making sure that we really sort of help organizations, I guess, maximize the value of people in the work environment. And of course, COVID has brought in so many challenges for many organizations to, I guess, continue maximizing people. And it's been a really interesting time to understand how organizations are dealing with people working at home and the implications of that, but also those organizations that are trying to bring people back into the work environment.
Mhm. Well, and you come to us with a very unique background. And in fact, it was very, very unique when you first started this, in that you have a tech background and a psychology background. You mind sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, I always tell people the story that I started off life wanting to be an aspirant architect and went to uni and started doing architecture and left because I really didn't like the mathematics behind it. But given that, it spurred me into sort of really taking a look at what I wanted to do, and I landed up studying psychology. But I always had this love for technology, and I had to ask my sort of lecturers back in those days whether I could include technology in my study, and they said, "Oh no, you need to do a different degree for that." So I ended up having to do two different degrees, one in psychology and one in information technologies. Which back then it was an odd thing to do, but today it's absolutely such a powerful skill to have, particularly in the area of analytics, where we can understand behavior, but also understand the numbers behind things. So yeah, that took me into a really interesting space in my career over the years to really have a foot in two different camps, I guess. One, really understanding technology, but two, really understanding people.
With that, you have an uncommonly clear way to connect the dots, how technology and the data within that technology is representing human behavior, some of the shortcomings, some of the biases that might be present. And I know you just mentioned this on LinkedIn recently about the Dunning Kruger effect and how that is very prevalent right now, not only as leaders adopt information, but how, what's happening in politics around the world, particularly here in the United States. So can you share about, the value and need, frankly, of linking what's happening with data and technology and human behavior?
Oh, absolutely. I think we're moving into an era of away from technology to really sort of understanding human behavior at a much deeper level using modern technologies, AI tools and machine learning tools. So the link between human behavior and technology is just becoming far more prevalent in everything that we do and far more important. But having said that, we run the risks, of course, the normal ones that we see around bias and algorithms not really understanding themselves in terms of how decisions are made, which is a massive risk that we go down. And we've always have to remember that people are human beings and we can't treat people like machines, and we shouldn't treat people like machines as much as sometimes we see it happening in terms of the development of technology. So I do see both technology and human behavior as complementary, particularly in the work environment, but the risks inherent in that are vast. And I think we've seen some of that emerging, during COVID in particular, both on the positive and negative side. So yeah, I think I'm not one person that loves to only look at one thing. I think linking things together is critical, particularly when humans are involved, because we are such complex beings. We don't just simply do ABC. Your ABC is not necessarily my ABC, and how you get from A to C is not necessarily the way that I get to the same point.
Mm-hmm.
So we personalize a lot, and I think technology is starting to move in that direction.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. And I believe personally that we haven't applied the level of creativity warranted to answer the questions leaders want or need to know. And when I say leaders, it could be individuals, it could be team leads. That requires us really asking hard questions like, do we have the appropriate data? Or conversely, is the data that we have more distracting than actually helpful? So my question is, number one, do you see certain dynamics either historically or currently that have validated that perspective? Or are you in this place where, hey, we're actually doing this quite well and we're just underutilizing it? Because many organizations are still, well, yeah, we kind of do people analytics, but we're not really, getting after it. So another way to frame the question is, what needs to take place to really get not only adoption, but get to a place where we have the insights that are meaningful, that are actionable, particularly with, the pandemic raging around the world still here in the summer of 2020.
It's a great question, Alan. Let me take an HR perspective, given that that's my background. I think COVID has shown us something really interesting, that for many HR functions, they were found wanting with regards to analytics. And some of that came to the fore when they started to realize that even though they had some data, it wasn't complete. And I think it was the Rewards and Benefits Association in the UK that brought out some really interesting stats where they said around about sort of 50% of responding companies to their questionnaire said they were unable to move quickly with COVID responses because they lack data. But for me, the second point that they made was actually more important. Around 53 or 55% of the respondents that did have data said they were unable to interpret the data correctly. And I think one of the things COVID has taught the HR function is that we, to a large extent, are really unprepared with understanding how we are using data for people analytics. And of course, there's been lots of good stories to tell. So this has not only been, negative towards HR. But one example that I saw, for example, was an organization that was using what I call proxy data. So they took something like their engagement survey data and applied that to dealing with wellness of people working at home. And whilst there's a lot of similarities in some of the data sets and the data that you would use, they're quite different in terms of the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So there's risk in terms of how data is being used and to inadvertently sort of look for answers, but finding answers, but which may be wrong. But generally, HR does need to have a step up in terms of their ability to understand data, to use data, and to make decisions using data going forward.
Yeah, let's dive in there a bit, because I've seen many organizations do just what you're contending, is that, well, we've been doing this survey for the past 3 years or longer. We have benchmarks, we have normative data, we have all this stuff, and that's great. However, it invites the question, is that generating appropriate data? And if not, do they have the processes and courage to actually change it, and might be throw it away entirely, or just might be a modification to really get the insights? And I've seen well-being elevated much higher because it seems to be more appropriate. Even safety with here in the United States with Black Lives Matter and unrest in urban areas. So, what do you think about that? The need to sometimes let go of data that was formerly of value and really create the space to identify what's going to be, in fact, appropriate to answer the questions leaders want or need to know at that particular moment.
Yeah, and I think if I take that question in its broader sense, I think many HR functions have actually gone down the track of trying to sort of become data analysts themselves and have failed. In fact, there was some stat a couple of years ago that said the biggest turnover of data scientists happened in the areas of social science where they were working. So if they were hired by the HR function, often it went wrong, and predominantly because the HR person and the data scientist person were not speaking the same language. And that comes from both sides, by the way. Some research that I did myself found that when a data scientist gets hired into the HR function, the requirement for them to know something about the human resources capability was round about sort of 3 to 5% in job adverts. Whereas when they moved into financial or procurement or other business areas, often that requirement of the data scientist to know something about that area was round about the 25% mark. So the HR person as well was often really not aware of what types of questions to be asking of the data scientist. So I think in many respects, the HR function needs to step back, as you were saying, and say, look, maybe we're not best at doing data science work ourselves, and we should either outsource that to a function within our business that's got better credibility and availability of resources to do that on our behalf, and learn how to sort of work with data over time before bringing it in. So it shouldn't just become the flavor of the month. Oh, we need to have a data scientist in our midst straight away. And I think so there's a lot of learning in the HR space to take place, but I will call out that there's a lot of good work happening, particularly at universities around the world, where they're changing the fundamental structure of how social sciences is taught to have a much stronger emphasis on technology and understanding around things like data.
Yeah, and to your point, it needs to happen, right? Because that's the reality that they're going to be dealing with when they go into organizations and work with employers that are the transactional systems that generate these data were not generated, correct me if I'm wrong, to be analyzed and generate insight. They're not for a research project. In other words, they're there to stand up or improve a certain process. As soon as we start to aggregate all that data and try and get some insight, there are risks, there are opportunities, there are a bunch of things that need to be acknowledged and improved upon. So with that, as we move forward in you working with multiple organizations, and obviously you have your structure of interpretation given your background, what's the ideal person to lead a people analytics capability? And do you think it should be a dedicated role within HR, or do you think it can be maybe a hybrid role, someone who shares, talent management, talent acquisition, or something like that? What are your thoughts there?
I think it could be, because we've seen a lot of new generation HR and talent people coming out who absolutely have the deeper understanding of technology and data. However, in those organizations where it doesn't exist, my recommendation to many of my clients is that bring somebody into the HR function that is a good analyst. Not necessarily a data scientist per se, but a person who can help analyze things and farm work out, but can be the translation between your leadership within HR and the actual requirement to assess data or to find things within data. So I think initially there's a person that's required to be a go-between. I don't think they need to be the leader of HR, but they certainly need to sort of have a passion for understanding analytics but also understanding people and people behavior. And in many respects, I think we've seen some of that starting to happen in COVID, where organizations have had to sort of deal with or HR functions of having to deal with how do we measure things like productivity of people who are working at home, and what are the sort of dynamics around the sort of wellness of people working at home, and those sort of things are quite fascinating and have spurred on, I think, some of the this discussion or the importance that HR functions need to become far more sort of comfortable dealing with data and making decisions around data.
With that in mind, there's a research that Microsoft has done recently about how remote work is affecting their culture and their experience among their workers, as well as productivity and a bunch of other interesting outcomes. Microsoft is Microsoft. They have Microsoft Teams and workplace analytics, so they have the data, and they also have the privacy and communication to support the privacy and the ethical use of the data. So I really celebrate what Dawn Klinghoffer and her team are doing there. But again, Microsoft is Microsoft. And so there are a lot of organizations in my purview that I see that are actually doing great. Their people analytics functions are really getting higher level influence, and they're meeting more frequently with a broader set of stakeholders. There are others, however, who have just almost been relegated to the back shop. where, they did not have the relationship equity, they did not have the systems knowledge and so forth in place. It's been pretty, there's very few that kind of just trudged along the middle, at least from my viewpoint. So given, we're in the summer of 2020, like we said, what are you seeing there with your clients in Australia and potentially elsewhere in the world? Do you see a similar dynamic unfolding? And for those who might be struggling, what would you recommend be done?
Yeah, so it is interesting, and I'll pick up on the point that you made about productivity. I think a lot of organizations during COVID have had to really sort of focus on productivity, and the first thing that came to the fore for many organizations was, do we trust our employees because we can't see them? And it's interesting. There were some interesting stats that came out. Around 35 to 40% of people 2 to 3 months ago were saying, yeah, absolutely, I want to go back to work, and I want to go back to the office. They resurveyed that same group of people, and that's dropped to around 5 to 10% of people. And predominantly that's because the work from home, the new normal, they've learned the digital tools, they've learned how to operate remotely. There's a sense of comfort coming in, but also there's a shift to understanding that we are now living at work for those people who are working at home. And that's brought on some really interesting dynamics. But the interesting thing is that that productivity measure is in many cases a self-rating. And so I think we are likely to see a new set of data emerging through new types of tools, not the big brother tools that we've seen in terms of 15-second screenshots of everything you're doing. That sort of stuff I think is nonsense in many respects, but real productivity measure tools that empower people to make sure that whilst at home, I stay both well and productive. So, almost like your sort of smartwatch, which gives you some sort of hints around when you should get up and walk around. I think we're going to see a lot more sort of personalized tools, and in that, a lot more sort of really interesting data that analysts can work with to understand productivity from remote workers. So that's one important thing I think we're going to see emerging, certainly in the next couple of months, El.
Yeah, and I see it already. Absolutely, there's a few technologies. Time is limited out of Prague, and Cassiopeia out of Israel that's actually based here in the Bay Area, and of course workplace analytics. And there's a host of tools that I absolutely, and frankly, I think they're long overdue. I think they could have been applied in many respects when we were actually in the workplace predominantly. But the need, to your point, is more pronounced given the remote work dynamic that we're now in. Yeah, obviously this theme screams ethics, and I would like to get your thoughts on that. But before we do, I want to ask you, about this. And we have a dynamic here in North America where we have people who are obviously working from home, but they have kids running around behind them. They have maybe elderly parents, and they have certain constraints that formerly were not visible at all. And a lot of times employers just didn't care. But now they are affecting productivity. And some are concerned that that's going to affect their performance and thus their compensation and their career development. So do you have thoughts on that? Should we be thinking differently around career development and what excellence looks like, and trying to accommodate these realities, these constraints that people have?
Oh, and I love this topic, El, because absolutely, I think careers and types of careers and all that sort of stuff is up for a massive change. You just think because we become so comfortable working from home, I might take a role in the US, but I don't physically have to work in the US anymore. So it's about, I think the opportunity to have the right person in the job through remote working has suddenly taken on a lot of interest in terms of how that can happen. But more to your point, I do think we firstly are having to change the way that leaders think. The reality of people working at home and kids running around, cat running across the keyboard, as we've seen, all those sort of things really talk to who we are, though, as humans. And this is real for us. And in many respects, our work environments of the past were sort of closed off to what real human life was all about. So I think we've seen a leadership change that's necessary, one that's humane, a lot more caring, a lot more community focused and compassionate. And I also think leaders are needing to understand that they have to adjust the way that they're going to recognize certain staff. Because there's a trend that's happening, and that's that there's a rise in resentment between the them versus us. And it's not management versus employees or the wealthy versus the average employer anymore. It's about the work from home versus the work on site.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of shift that's taking place is creating a fractured workforce in many respects. And leadership absolutely needs to be on top of that in terms of how we're going to recognize people differently. So we can break down that resentment and break down that them versus us. So I think a lot of what you mentioned comes back to how management, supervisory, and leadership styles are going to have to adjust behaviorally to allay fears in people, because there's a lot of fear out there. Am I still going to have a job in 3 months' time if I'm still working at home? And those organizations that I've seen doing really well is where that leadership has adjusted to that, and the recognition that we need to behave differently as leaders towards our employees.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for saying that. And I 100% agree. And it implied or underpinning everything that you just shared is the need to innovate. When you talk about think differently, that means that we have to ultimately do things differently. And it might be, early days in the whole scheme of things, and I believe it is. However, the fact that we're working from home went like that. The fact that we're studying things differently, it's edged along, but the processes around recognition and compensation, I see them on the table of discussion, but I haven't seen them change yet. And again, there's no criticism here. It's just an observation. But where I want to land this with a question is, there needs to be this open-mindedness, this appetite for innovation. I have this fear that some who've been in a role for 20, 30 plus years, where have a cover your ass mentality and won't take the leap necessary to really create a culture that's fair, equitable, that really engages people in ways that will have them be focused and productive when they're in the home. So can you speak to your kind of basis for innovation and where that change is actually going to come from? What needs to happen?
Yeah, and let me cite a client discussion that I had a few weeks ago, probably a couple of months ago now. One of the clients had to really quickly move a lot of their staff to front-end roles. As COVID was rolling out, they needed a lot more front-end people to deal with the phones, take people's calls and things like that. And normally that was a 3-week training course that took place for a person to learn to become a front-end staff member. But COVID pushed them into a situation that wasn't possible. So they did the same course in 2 days with a little bit of mentoring. And the aha effect was, oh, heck, we got the same outcome. So I think there's this massive opportunity that exists, not just in the HR space, but I'll use that example carrying on, that suddenly we've got, hang on a minute, we did what took 3 weeks in 2 days and we had the same outcome. Surely the logical extension from that is, what else have we been doing that doesn't have to take that long, and can we optimize a lot better? So I think the innovation is going to come out spurred on by things like COVID, and not just in the technology space, but things like basic training and development of people, how we do things is going to rapid change. And that was a really good aha moment for this particular client that thought, oh wow, people can change a lot quicker than what we thought, and we don't need to sort of prolong things unnecessarily. So great insight into people's ability to change rapidly. But what I would also say, Al, is that I think we're going to see a great proliferation of certain types of technologies coming to the fore. The things like robots coming in, cleaning robots. So I was reading about Violet. I don't know if you know about Violet, but she's an ultraviolet deep cleaner. It's basically like a big light bulb on wheels. And She goes around emitting ultraviolet light and doing deep cleaning. She's quick and safe, and she's not necessarily replacing human cleaners who still need to clean the nooks and crannies. But I think we're going to become a lot more comfortable with seeing physical type robots in the work environment. Screening robots are another one, particularly in healthcare facilities. So before I walk in, it's going to take my temperature. It's going to check if I've got a mask. It may ask me a number of questions. And the other one that I think we're going to see a rise of is telepresence robots, which have been around for a while, but was a little bit of a kind of a fad, I guess, where I can have an iPod on wheels basically, but it's an avatar for me in a real physical workspace that I can control remotely from home or wherever. But it builds on, it'll certainly help certain people stay attached and feel like they're really part of an environment. So yeah, I think there's a great amount of innovation that's coming out of COVID, or it's been spurred on by COVID.
I love what you're sharing, and there's a host of ways we can go down that particular theme around the future of work and what is our capacity going to be as human beings relative to robotic automation, AI, and so forth. So if you want to touch on that before we wrap, please do so, because I'm interested to talk about that in relation to ethics in particular. But again, that can be a whole discussion in and of itself. But you are really uniquely qualified to answer this particular question, in that if we are looking at data, we as human beings have an emotional response to that. As individuals, particularly when it reflects on our decision making, and even in groups when we're influencing a culture, for example. In other words, if I'm in a room as an executive leadership team and I'm looking at this workforce data, there's people around the room, and it could be a virtual room now, where they're having an emotional response to it. And historically, I've seen an underappreciation of that. It's like, there's the facts, everyone should be okay with it. There's a clear direction moving forward. However, there are resistors, there are feelings that come up, and they might be running against a myth. They might be running against what someone has experienced for the last 20 or 30 years. So my question again is, what's your coaching or advice to those who have not really addressed that reality, that as we look at dashboards and reports and infographics and all these things, that we are having an emotional response to them, and that's going to affect the decisions that we make as an outcome?
Great question, Alan. And again, another area that I absolutely love, but I think, and it does tie in all those things that you said, including ethics. The one thing that we cannot change is that everybody is unique, and everybody's reaction to many things is going to be unique. And whilst there are certainly universal behaviors that we exhibit as human beings, the way that you and I perceive the world and approach the world is vastly different, which is why I've always said that we've seen a shift towards personalization of technologies, or the ability to individualize or personalize technologies. And that's where I particularly call out a risk around some of the tools that are emerging, that are AI driven and have got engines in the background that are making decisions. Things like, for example, around recruitment or recruitment screening. I'm really scared about that kind of stuff, particularly when the user, who happens to be the HR function, cannot fully explain a decision that has been made. It's a risk for people, but I think in many respects may very well be losing a lot of people who simply may have been uncomfortable in front of a screen, talking to somebody via a Skype call or something, or some robotic tool assessing their facial recognition or gestures in a negative way, which it may not have been. So we have to be really careful that the way you perceive something and the way that I perceive something is very different. And my recommendation to many organizations is, when you can offer choice, you should, because choice is absolutely important to human beings, particularly in Western societies, not necessarily all the whole world, but in Western society, choice is really important to motivation, but also the ability to move forward and to keep me doing the things, keep me interested in what I'm doing. So yeah, I think that's a whole nother discussion, to be honest, but ethically it's important that we approach these technologies right, but choice to people is something that is hypercritical, I think, moving forward.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. And, as we start to wrap up, I mean, it speaks to the fact that there are biases that are embedded in the data. There's biases that we have as human beings. And not only do we have to call those out, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have to have the creativity and open-mindedness to either push them to the side and say that's not appropriate, or create new ways of either capturing data, analyzing data, creating new data. Is that what you would advocate, that we create the space to explore what's appropriate and what's not?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'll use my sort of one of my COVID things that I've been learning from home. Learning Australian Sign Language I've been started 3 months ago. And I'll tie it back to what you mentioned right in the beginning, Al, as well, in terms of the Dunning Kruger effect, that once you start learning and apply your mind to something, it's you immerse yourself in a new world. But in that immersion phase, you also realize that you know very little. And, initially, whilst you think you know a great, 50, 100 words in terms of Australian Sign Language, I think I'm going great. The longer you go down the path, the more you realize that the less you know. And so that's really important in terms of how we move forward, in terms of understanding data, understanding the way that we work with data, is that get immersed, getting really involved. And that's my challenge to all people who want to do something with things like data analytics. The more you immerse yourself, you are going to go through a phase of being concerned that you don't know a lot, but the value that it brings out in terms of understanding will really stand you in a strong stead going forward.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. And just to play that back for our listeners, is that as a leader, whether it be in HR, business, IT, even data science, it's not just, hey, go do that. You have to be involved in the process. You have to understand the underpinnings of the work. You might not be involved in doing the work, being the data scientist or do the data architecture and all that, but you need to get involved. You're not just a customer, but you're an active participant in the creation process. Would you echo that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me, many years ago, I remember one of my team saying to me, "Hey, Rob, how come you're so good at Excel? Can you teach me things at Excel?" And I said, "No, until you find a problem, I won't teach you." Because often, in theory, trying to learn something like Excel could be a complete waste of time. But if I have a very specific problem that I'm trying to solve, your learning becomes so much more richer. And it's the same with anything that we want to learn. Find a problem that you're trying to solve, and the tools and mechanisms that you have around you that you apply to that problem will become a far more richer experience.
Rob, it gave me a chill. I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's absolutely spot on. Beautiful advice. And, thank you for sharing today. Any closing comments as we start to wrap?
No, it's been a great talking to you, El, and it's been exciting. I think it's an exciting space that we're in, both from an HR point of view, from a data analytics point of view, and from really understanding human behavior in pandemics like we have. It can only get better, and I think there's a lot of great opportunities that we're going to see coming out of this.
Well, I of course share your enthusiasm, and I learn from you each time we talk. So thank you for sharing today, and look forward to seeing you in person before too long. Unfortunately, this is going to be our reality for the foreseeable future. But again, thanks for your contributions to the space, and thanks for doing what you do and being who you are. Really appreciate you.
Thanks, Al, and nice to meet you.
All right, see ya.